to junction 18 for Middlewich. And in Bedfordshire, on the M1 northbound, an accident involving a lorry and a car has closed one lane. Traffic slow between junction 10 for the M1 and junction 11 for Dunstable Road. Joe Critcher, 5 Live Travel.
Get more from BBC 5 Live with 5 Live Podcasts.
The great joy of this podcast is we can indulge in being nerdy.
If people didn't want it, we wouldn't be doing it. It's as simple as that.
How much you read into that, I think, is tricky.
Just released the incredible true crime podcast, Beyond Reasonable Doubt.
It was all about Michael, like he was the victim, and now Michael is alive. Kathleen has been 15 years in her grave.
I would never have done anything to hurt her. I am innocent of these charges, and we will prove it in court.
Download at bbc.co.uk/5live or using your usual podcast app. Get more from BBC 5 Live. This is BBC 5 Live, available on the BBC iPlayer radio app. 5 Live Daily with Adrian Childs.
It's just gone 25 to 11. Since January, there's been effectively no government in Northern Ireland. The power-sharing coalition at Stormont collapsed over a row over a green energy scheme. Chris Page is our island correspondent. Chris, can we do this slightly differently? Can I just share with you the little I understand of this, and you tell me what I'm getting wrong or what else I need to know? Can we do it like that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Right, OK. So there was this green energy scheme, which was either cock-up or conspiracy, and that's part of the problem with it. It's yet to be decided. Sinn Féin then walked out and had enough. Then there were the assembly elections, which kind of empowered Sinn Féin because they did very well. Then there was the general election when DUP did quite well, so that kind of empowered them. And now we've got this supply, confidence and supply arrangement, which has muddied the waters still further. How on earth is there supposed to be a deal by this deadline on Thursday?
It is a very complex picture, which I have to say, Adrian, I think you've summarised pretty well. The effective deadline for the restoration of the Wolf government, as you say, is Thursday, but the pressure's really on today, because in order for this to be sorted out in time for Thursday, well, the parties involved will probably have to take any deal back to their supporters, to their ruling bodies. So that means that really the guts of a deal has to be hammered out by the end of today or by tomorrow morning. Now, the main differences between the parties as it stands at the moment come over issues like, for example, legal recognition for the Irish language, which Sinn Féin wants, the introduction of same-sex marriage in Northern Ireland. The DUP don't want that, Sinn Féin do. There's also a very tricky issue of how you deal with hundreds of unsolved killings from the Troubles. So when you add all that into the mix, as well as the issues which you've previously mentioned, you get a picture of how difficult it is going to be to sort out this situation.
Wasn't the Irish language issue, just to take one of those three things, I'm sure all three things were in play, wasn't this an issue during power sharing? Surely they've been arguing about this for long before the green energy scheme came in and went wrong.
Well, that's right. The DUP and Sinn Féin had 10 years in Northern Ireland's power-sharing government together. When they first went into that partnership back in 2007, it was hailed around the world as something extraordinary that two sides could come together like that. And you had the Protestant preacher, the Reverend Ian Paisley, the embodiment of hardline unionism for many people, leading the government alongside the former IRA commander Martin McGuinness. But in truth, the relationship between the DUP and Sinn Féin was never going to be easy, and the differences over a range of issues. And the Irish language certainly was one of those issues, but I suppose over the years that was built up as an issue, and the final row between the parties came, as you've already said, over, of all things, a green energy scheme, the renewable heat incentive, which had been managed by DUP ministers and went well over budget. And it was really at that the then Deputy First Minister, the late Martin McGuinness of Sinn Féin, resigned his post, and that meant that the power sharing executive collapsed in January. But as well as that issue which precipitated the final collapse, if you like, there'd been a whole string of issues which had been building up between the parties, driving a wedge between them. The Irish language was certainly one issue, same-sex marriage another. These are two parties that don't just disagree on the issues of identity in Northern Ireland. So there's not just a problem there because one is unionist and one is nationalist. They have differences across a whole range of issues, including economic issues. So it's always going to be an uneasy relationship, and now the pressure is on to try to get them back into government together. If that doesn't happen, then devolution in Northern Ireland pretty much goes into the deep freeze indefinitely, and it looks like ministers in London will have to take over running Northern Ireland.
What are the personalities like here in terms of their relationship with each other. So famously we had Paisley and McGuinness, the most unlikely bedfellows, the Chuckle brothers and so on, both no longer with us. What is the mood music like between Michelle O'Neill and Arlene Foster?
Yes, Michelle O'Neill, the leader of Sinn Féin at Stormont, took over from Martin McGuinness in that role earlier this year. She had been before that a minister in the Stormont executive. She'd been the health minister. Before that, she'd been the agriculture minister. So she was used to working with DUP ministers as a member of the power sharing executive. She might have been a particularly well-known name in the rest of the UK, but certainly in Northern Ireland she was making her mark as a Sinn Féin spokesperson, as a minister in that executive. So Arlene Foster likewise had been a minister for a long time before she became First Minister. She'd been in charge of the Enterprise Department, she'd been in charge of the Environment Department. So both Mrs Foster and Mrs O'Neill have experience of working with each other over quite a number of years in terms of the nitty-gritty of governing Northern Ireland, of making decisions about budgets and so on.
Okay, but do they do much chuckling together?
I don't think you could say no. Well, I don't think they do much chuckling together. Whenever they clashed in debates in the run-up to both the Northern Ireland Assembly election in March and later on, whenever there was the general election campaign, you didn't get the impression that there was a particularly warm relationship there. That's for sure. Both of them, I think, would describe the relationship between their parties as business-like. They do, I think, at heart recognise that they have to be pragmatic. They have to make compromises in order to make any partnership work at all, but I don't get the sense there's any particularly personal chemistry between those two leaders. However, if there is a deal, then they will have to share the office of First and Deputy First Ministers, and they will have to be the joint leaders of Northern Ireland.
What do you gauge is the greatest appetite for? Is it to make this work, or is it to keep arguing? I suppose that's what it boils down to. Which of those two is in the ascendance?
Yes, I think it is basically all about political will. All the parties in Northern Ireland say that they're better off with devolution, with the devolved government here in Belfast, than without one. But the question is, can they find some sort of an agreement which would enable them to share power, and not just enable them to get enough concessions from each other to bring forward the policies that they would like over the next few years, but also enough to satisfy their supporters. You've really had a polarisation of politics in Northern Ireland. As you mentioned at the start, Adrian, you had Sinn Féin making gains in the Assembly election in March, then you had the DUP making gains in the general election, which has put them in a prime position in Westminster. But in that general election, Sinn Féin also did pretty well, and in fact they are now the only parties in Northern Ireland with any MPs at Westminster. So it really does come down to these two parties. The DUP would say they've no red lines, they go back into government tomorrow. The Sinn Féin would say they do want the Stormont executive back up and running, but only on terms which they believe is fair. So it does come down, I think, to whether or not the parties really want to do the business, whether they think they can sell a deal to their supporters. And over the next 48 hours we should see if there's going to be a future for devolution here, or if we're going to be heading for direct rule from Westminster.
Thanks, Chris. Our Ireland correspondent Chris Page. Just coming up to 11:15, a British-born Sikh Indian couple claim they've been told they can't adopt a white child because of their ethnic background. Sandeep and Reena Manda, who live in Berkshire, say they were rejected by their local adoption agency, Adopt Berkshire, because only white children are available. The couple are legally challenging the decision with the backing of the Equality and Human Rights Commission and their MP, one Theresa May. I wonder if this chimes with your experience of trying to adopt. What sort of barriers that you can't really get your head round or put up in front of you? Call 08085 909 693 or text 85058. At BBC 5 Live on social media. Alice Noon is head of the Adoption and Permanent Families for the adoption charity Quorum in London. Alice, what do you suppose has gone wrong here? And this is against the rules, as I understand them, what's happened.
Yeah, you are so right, it is against the rules. Well, I think this particular agency has certainly misunderstood the law. The law is really clear about prioritising all of children's needs and not exclusively thinking about ethnicity and an ethnic match. You know, there are a lot of children who need permanent families through adoption, and they should have the opportunity of a family, whatever their race and background, and couples who can meet the needs. You know, it's about children, all children's needs. You know, culture and ethnicity, that's part of a child's background, and you need to be aware of that, but there's a lot more to a child's needs than just having a family that have the same kind of racial or cultural heritage as they do.
This couple say they're willing to give home to a child of any race. So just to be clear, as far as you can see, they have been wrongly treated.
Yes, I mean, if they are clear that they would consider a child of a different, it's up to them. Some families want to consider a child who perhaps looks more like them, who's going to kind of fit into their wider family, and that's the adopter's choice.
And that's reasonable from the adopter's point of view?
Yeah.
I mean, in the eyes of the rules, that's reasonable?
Yes, it is. And, because this is an adopter-led child focus process, if you like. And if we want to do the best for children, then obviously for adopters to feel that they are adopting a child that fits well into their family, and they're going to be able to support and bring up till they're grown up and a long time beyond potentially, that's crucial, obviously. So adopters have to feel comfortable about the child that's joining their family, and for some families that will be a child who's of a different cultural background to their own, and for some families it may not be. But for the local authority to actually say to adopters that they wouldn't consider them because they haven't got a child just the same as them to match them with, it is not lawful, and it's also not good for children.
So the rules were changed to stop this kind of thing happening in 2014, which is the other thing I don't understand.
No, well, I mean, to be honest, I saw this. I said I would come on the programme today because I had already seen this article. A colleague of mine at work had sent it to me this morning, and I'd already kind of read it with sort of astonishment, actually, that an agency could not have understood the law, which is very clear, and as you say, was changed in 2014. And it's basically, the law says we need to think about all children's needs equally. We shouldn't kind of prioritise one particular need over another. So it's a kind of balancing act of getting the best family for any particular child. And kind of ethnicity might be in the mix for a particular child where they've got perhaps a very strong alignment with a particular cultural heritage, and perhaps they're older and they've always lived in a particular kind of family. You'd have to take all that into account. But it's not, it shouldn't have been done like this. This is very poor practice in my view.
So the background to this is what in terms of the figures? Are there a shortage of babies that are available for couples to adopt, or are there a shortage of couples who want to adopt babies? Which way round?
Well, sadly, it's both in some ways, because what there tends to be is there are people, understandably, who aren't able to have children themselves, and often those people start off by thinking that they would like to adopt a baby. That's completely understandable. A lot of the children who are in the care system who need adoptive families are not babies. So there's a kind of mismatch, if you like, between the children that people think of when they want to adopt and the children that actually need permanent families.
Okay, so they want a bouncing baby, and that is, it generally is children who are a bit older.
Yeah, it is, and to be honest, even if it is a bouncing baby, most of the a baby who is removed from a birth parent, at birth, is a baby who's already had a lot of things happen to them before they were even born.
Yeah.
So probably their mum might have been taking drugs, or there might have been, a lot of things going on that have already affected that baby. So the baby might do fine in the end, but it's not as bouncing as you'd like it to be, really, because it's had a pretty poor start already.
So where are the log jams between the two then, and how can they be eased?
Well, I think talking to people does a lot. I mean, I think a lot of people approach adoption agencies like Quorum, and they don't necessarily know about these things. Why should they? It's still a relatively rare thing for a child to be adopted. We're not talking about millions of children. We're talking about relatively small numbers, and people don't understand necessarily about children coming into care and the difficulties that their families have experienced. And often we find that by kind of, filling in the background for people, by sort of directing people to some really great sources of information where people can begin to understand the backgrounds of children and their real need to join permanent families, because what we do know is that children who are adopted do really well and kind of really flourish in their adoptive families and can make up for some of those deficits that they've experienced perhaps as babies or young children. So lots of people, they might start off thinking that they want a baby, but actually when they understand more about the kind of landscape of adoption, they can consider a slightly older child. I mean, most children who are adopted are, the biggest slice of children who are adopted are 4 and under. So we're not talking about children who are much older. We're talking about children who are still able to benefit and fit into a new family, because obviously that's a tall order for a child as well as for parents.
But there's also a postcode lottery, it seems to me, in play here. It depends. I mean, you ask 3 different people in charge of doing this, and you get 4 different answers from people. I know the brilliant work that Quorum do, but I just happen to know somebody who adopted through you, and it's been a fantastic success after, a difficult start.
Nice.
However, you were about the 3rd point of call, and she got nowhere before that. I mean, you would have thought there were rules and everybody abided by them.
I mean, I think what we believe at Quorum is that there are tons of people who will make great adopters, and there'll be all sorts of people, and I hope that's what most agencies believe, but I mean, I think at Quorum we really do put that into practice, and we really try and make sure that an agency looking for adopters to approve and then place children with, we don't have all the kind of work that a local authority has to do, for everything from looking after the roads to looking after children. So we are in a good position to kind of really be focused and kind of dedicated to the task. And I think lots of local authorities do. Consequently, there are lots of people who come to us who are able to go on and adopt. We're in a better position. Really good job, in some ways in more difficult circumstances than we work in.
I just had a text. What would you say to this? It's from Andy. It says, a white child going to school with 2 Sikh parents is at best going to be treated as a curiosity, and at worst will be stigmatised and bullied incessantly. What's he getting wrong? He says, I hate to use the hackneyed phrase political correctness gone mad, but this is indeed political correctness gone quite insane. So, at issue here, is it perfectly okay? Could you assure him that Sikh parents can have a white child and that can be made to work?
It depends on everybody's willingness to work with that. There are, I think for adopters, those adopters would have to be comfortable with that, and lots of adopters, I think I mentioned, prefer to adopt a child who looks more like them, and we don't have a problem with that.
But his point isn't the adopters. I don't think he's questioning the Sikh parents. He's questioning whether society will be kind to them, whether they will be judged.
It depends on where you live. If you live in London, I mean, if you walk down the street in London, or I'm sure in Manchester, or in lots of our big conurbations, you see all kinds of families, and I don't think that anybody kind of often even notes things like, is that child a different cultural heritage from the parent that's holding their hand? I think sometimes in some situations you have got to be aware of what it's going to be like. We are a child-focused service, and we do have to think about what it's going to be like for a child. So if a child was, say, already 7, had always lived in a family where they looked like their parents, we might think very carefully about before placing that child in adoptive parents who looked very different from them, because that might not be good for the child, and we have to be led by the child's needs. But to have a sort of one-size-fits-all that says that you have to have ethnic matching, that's not sensible and doesn't.
Alice, thanks very much indeed. No, nice talking to you, Alice. Thanks for coming on.
Good, and to you.
All the best. Thanks. That's Alice Noon from the adoption charity Quorum. Sean's here from 5 Live Money. So Google's had a smack bottom.
To put it mildly, one that will cost them £2 billion. Biggest fine ever dished out by the European Commission when it comes to competition issues. Previously, Intel put it mildly.
We are a child-focused service, and we do have to think about what it's going to be like for a child. So if a child was, say, already 7, had always lived in a family where they looked like their parents, we might think very carefully about before placing that child in adoptive parents who looked very different from them.
Had a £1 billion fine, but £2 billion for Google. And this is, not surprisingly, linked to its dominance in the search engine market, but it's to do with specifically the shopping section of Google's website and front page. So when you search for something, particularly if it's something you want to buy, using Google, quite prominently at the top of that search are quite a few options to be able to buy something through the first click being through Google's website. They've done a bit of a comparison of different products, and that is there. And there's been a lot of complaints from rivals saying that is just unfair, that within the Google search engine they're using their own search engine to give prominence to effectively their own comparison sites. So there's been lots of businesses out there, Yelp, TripAdvisor, who have complained for many, many years now. This has been a 7-year investigation by the European Commission. Microsoft were one of those companies as well that kicked that off. So Google now looks set to appeal. That seems pretty likely. They think that the European Commission are barking up the wrong tree a little bit when it comes to looking at them. They have views that other websites like eBay and Amazon have more of a monopoly on people's spending habits. But huge fine. And does this lead the way now for the European Commission to look at and potentially fine Google for maps, for other information sharing that Google has on its website that it clearly has big monopolies on, but is it using them fairly?
Sean Farrington from 5 Live Money. Just getting towards 11 o'clock. Philip Pullman, creator of the Northern Lights trilogy, is auctioning off the chance to name a character in his latest book to raise money for the victims of the Grenfell Tower fire. It's attracted a bid from the former teacher of one of those young people who died in the fire, James Clements. This teacher bid £1,500 to have the character named after his former pupil. Tell me about your pupil, James. Thanks for
Hello, thanks a lot. Well, I taught Nahuda when I was a primary school teacher working in a primary school near the local area. Yeah, she was the most wonderful child. She was delightful and fun and hard-working and all the things you'd hope for, really. She was wonderful.
So you bid £1,500. What's happened since?
Well, yeah, I went onto the website and as a bit of a kind of whim, really, to have a look and see what was there, and there was the option to bid for a character's name, and I thought, well, you know, maybe I could bid for it for myself, but that's perhaps a little bit vainglorious. Maybe I could bid for one of my children, but whichever one I put the name for, the other one will probably hate me for life. And then, obviously, Nahuda and her family had been in my thoughts for a few weeks, and it just kind of popped in my head. So as a whim, I filled out the form and sent it off to a corner of the internet, thinking, well, it'll probably just lurk there. Probably someone will come along quite quickly and beat my bid, because it's an amazing prize. And then the person who bid after me, a lady called Claire Wilson, spotted the bid and said, look, actually, would it be possible to add to James's bid rather than to replace it? And the person in charge of the website said, yeah, absolutely, of course. And that little tiny act of kindness kind of has snowballed, and now I think hundreds and hundreds of people have contributed to this one big giant bid. It's become a huge team effort, and I think as of this morning it was sitting somewhere around £26,000.
Right, that's fantastic. Well, Philip Pullman made all this possible, and Philip joins us now, I'm delighted to say. So, Philip, it's a great gesture by you. Presumably, Huda is going to win, so to speak. Can you work with the poor girl's name?
Oh, yes, of course I can. And it's not a great gesture by me, really, because it's very easy for me to do that. I think it's a great gesture by James, the teacher who set this going. So I was very happy to offer the name of a character up for auction, because I wanted to do something to help the victims of this appalling fire.
Well, I don't know whether you've been to the scene. I drove past it for the first time on the main road next to it, and much as I've been watching it on the news for 2 weeks, you just can't believe what you're seeing when you get close to it.
No, I haven't, because I live in Oxford and I don't often have occasion to go into London. But the pictures of the fire at night, the first night, are just unforgettable, indelible, extraordinary and horrible. It was a tragedy of the most, well, as David Lammy, I think the MP said, this was a crime. It was a crime, and someone needs to be found out and punished for it.
Okay, well, thanks for making your offer, and some good's come out of it. So, Philip Pullman, thanks for joining us. And, James, you'll be watching the bids grow with interest.
Absolutely, yes. We've got till 8 o'clock this evening to hang on. So thank you so much to everybody that's helped and supported. It's become the most wonderful team effort, the most wonderful life-affirming thing, really, to see how wonderful people can be. OK, James, thanks very much. James Clements, who started off the bid to have a Philip Pullman character named after his former pupil, a 16-year-old victim, Nahuda El-Wahabi. It's just coming up to 11 o'clock now. In the next hour, we'll be looking at what's happening in Syria. The US says the government there's planning another chemical weapons attack, and if it does that, it'll face grave consequences.
Live Sport. This is BBC 5 Live.
Just gone 11 o'clock on 5 Live. Adrian Chiles here with 5 Live Daily.
The top news on 5 Live this hour. The Conservative government's defending its deal with the DUP.
In sport, the Lions let slip a 16-point lead to draw with the Hurricanes.
And if you're out and about this morning, take us with you. Listen on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the iPlayer radio app.
This is BBC 5 Live.
Let's get the BBC News on 5 Live with Joe Critcher.
The Defence Secretary has told 5 Live it's right more resources are spent on Northern Ireland even without a DUP Conservative deal. Sir Michael Fallon's been defending his party's decision to give £1 billion to the country in return for the Democratic Unionist support. Here's the DUP MP for Lygon Valley, Geoffrey Donaldson.
We're coming from a long way behind, and therefore I think this money, if I may say so, is justified in terms of helping Northern Ireland catch up on the rest of the UK in terms of investing in our vital infrastructure such as schools, hospitals, roads and so on.
The government's indicated it would support US military action against the Syrian government if President Assad carried out a chemical weapons attack. The White House says it's identified potential preparations similar to those before a suspected strike in April. James Jeffrey was Deputy National Security Advisor under George W. Bush.
I'm incredulous that the Syrians would actually think about doing this again, because this is an overt challenge to the Trump administration and frankly to the United States. The statement said if Assad does this, he and his regime will pay a heavy price. A heavy price isn't losing 20 or 30 airplanes. We're talking about decapitation.
All private landlords are being urged to carry out immediate cladding checks on high-rise buildings. Samples from 75 tower blocks have so far failed safety tests. Douglas Haig is Vice Chair of the Residential Landlords Association.
If you owned just one individual flat in a high-rise building, then effectively your responsibility stops at the front door of that flat as a landlord for ensuring fire safety. So it would be to do things like making sure in England there are requirements around installing a smoke detector on every floor and generally ensuring that the information on evacuation procedures are given to the tenants when they move in.
It comes as new government figures show more than 50 fires in high-rise tower blocks in England last year spread from the room where they started. The Home Office data reveals the overall number of fires in blocks of flats was 714, the lowest for 7 years. The public spending watchdog says at least 1,700 patients may have been harmed when thousands of NHS England records were accidentally put in storage. Cancer test results and child protection notes were among the documents that went missing. The European Commission's fined Google nearly €2.5 billion after finding the company abused its power by promoting its own shopping comparison service at the top of search results. It's the regulator's largest ever penalty for a company accused of distorting the market. The German newspaper Bild says it's seen an unpublished FIFA report into alleged corruption during Qatar's successful 2022 World Cup bid. It was written in 2014. Our sports news correspondent is Richard Conway.
They've talked about how 3 executive committee members of FIFA were flown on a Qatar Football Association private plane. They've talked about the role of the Aspire Academy, which is a football academy system that Qatar has, and the role of that in what they say was the manipulation of voting officials.
Qatar's categorically denied any wrongdoing. Now the sport with Ellis Lloyd.
The British and Irish Lions let slip a 16-point half-time lead to draw 31-all with the Hurricanes in Wellington. Lockie and Henderson was sin-binned midway through the second half, with the hosts scoring twice, with the Lions down to 14 men. Tommy Seymour scored 2 tries, while George North also went over for the Lions, but Dan Biggar missed a drop goal to win. After a delayed start due to the weather, England's women are just getting underway against Pakistan at the World Cup. Henry Moran is in Leicester.
Asked to bat first, England are underway. 6 without loss in the first over. Big lead off first up though. Tammy Beaumont dropped first ball at first lip. Tough chance, but a big lead off for England. 6 without loss in the first over.
You can hear commentary on 5 Live Sports Extra. And World Cup winner Jurgen Klinsmann has distanced himself from speculation that he could return to management at Sunderland. The German's been out of football since being sacked by the United States in November.
This is BBC 5 Live on digital, online, smartphone and tablet.
It's going to remain pretty wet across northern parts of the UK this afternoon. While most of the heavy rain will clear away, it's going to stay quite damp and drizzly for much of Scotland and northern England during this afternoon. Temperatures typically about 16, 17 degrees, but I think around the northeast of Scotland, northeast England, it could be a little bit chillier, about 11 or 12 Celsius. For Northern Ireland, this afternoon we're expecting some heavy and thundery showers to develop. Those could be fairly slow moving in between some bright spells, highs of 18 degrees. And then further south